Thanks for coming. I hope you've been having good sessions. I guess I would identify myself as an environmental economist. So I try to look for ways that through public policy we can figure out how best to achieve our environmental goals, how we can achieve them at the lowest cost, choosing among different policy options. Another thing I look at is try to figure out what should be the targets for environmental protection. How much, for example, greenhouse gas reductions is appropriate given the sacrifices involved as well as the benefits in the form of avoided damages to climate. So I'm going to talk about cap and trade, as Sally indicated, but I'm going to actually start a little bit more general. You're probably all familiar with this, you know, that the IPCC every 5 or 6 years gets together and figures out what's projected under business as usual in terms of climate change, changes in temperature and precipitation. People are concerned about that alone, but really it's the attendant effects on the biophysical effects and the effects on human welfare that really count, that we're especially concerned about. And here are some of them: sea level rise, expansion of the tropics and tropical diseases, impacts on energy needs, impacts on agriculture, impacts on ecosystems and various forms of wildlife. You know about all this. And it suggests that there's a role for policy to try to avoid some of these impacts, particularly if the cure is no worse than the disease. The IPCC comes out every 5 or 6 years with an assessment saying, here's what we know about the science, here's what are some of the policy options and what we know about what they would cost and how much they would benefit. We get strengthening claims over each time that the IPCC has come up with its consensus statements. The strongest one was the latest one. It says that most of the observed increase in surface temperatures since the mid-20th century is very likely due to human causes, that is, anthropogenic greenhouse gas concentrations. At the same time, the public doesn't uniformly agree with what the scientists are saying. Here's some results from a Gallup poll, which indicate that what you see in the green line is the percent of those polled in the US that think that climate change is due to a significant extent from human activities, emissions of greenhouse gases from human activities. And you see that that number has fallen slightly since 2003, and it might be falling a little bit even now. And yet, actually, if you look at the statements by many politicians, particularly at the federal level, there's even less support for the idea that climate change is occurring or that humans are contributing to it. So it's a significant political challenge, and I'll have more to say about that in a moment. But what I want to really focus on are different policy options. And I'm going to distinguish at least 4 types. There's a carbon tax, a tax on fossil fuels in proportion to the carbon content of those fuels, because the carbon content in most uses dictates how much emissions of carbon dioxide will occur, except for maybe 3 or 4% of the use of fossil fuels, which ends up going into petrochemical feedstocks. Cap and trade is very similar to a carbon tax, as I'll explain. And these 2 approaches are more flexible. Another option is performance standards, where firms are required to have a certain, cannot have the ratio of emissions to the use of the technology exceeding a certain amount. An example of a performance standard would be like the tailpipe emissions requirements that you have to face when you bring your car in for a smog check. The concentrations cannot exceed a certain amount of these hydrocarbons. And then there's direct technology promotion. You know, why go for these indirect approaches? Why not subsidize game-changing technologies directly? So I want to talk about all these briefly. These first ones I'm going to call emissions pricing policies because they effectively put a price on emissions. So the first thing I want to say is that a carbon tax and cap and trade, although they're different, they have a lot in common. A carbon tax works as follows. How many of you have taken at least some economics, like principles of economics? Most of you have. So in any case, think of this curve. This is the business as usual amount of emissions, let's say for the economy as a whole in the aggregate. And this line going from right to left indicates the marginal cost of reducing emissions for the whole economy. So it rises the more you reduce emissions, the more at the margin it costs. And in the presence of a carbon tax of T, the facilities will want to keep reducing emissions as long as the cost of doing that is less than the tax itself. Because every time you reduce emissions, you're avoiding having to pay a tax, which is even higher.
So you keep doing that until at the margin, the cost of reducing emissions any further is just equal to the tax rate. You wouldn't want to go any further. So this tax of T implies emissions for the economy as a whole of E1. It's associated with this tax. Cap and trade actually works very similarly, except that instead of giving the price or tax and having emissions be the result, it's the other way around. Under cap and trade, you fix the amount of emissions that are allowed. That's how many permits or allowances are given out. And then that forces people to reduce. And in fact, the price of the emissions allowances will end up being the marginal abatement cost at this boundary or at the cap. Reason being that people will be willing to pay up to their marginal abatement cost in order to not have to reduce emissions any further. They'd be willing to pay that much for an allowance. So basically, they're kind of the reverse of each other. In one case, you set the price and the emissions falls out. In the other case, you set the emissions and the price falls out. Well, different people on different sides of the political spectrum might favor one or the other. Environmental groups often favor cap and trade because policy dictates the level of emissions, so there's little uncertainty about that, provided that it's enforced. And what's uncertain is the price that will result, because we don't know the position of this curve in advance. So environmentalists feel like they want to be assured of a certain level of emissions being reduced. They might favor cap and trade. Businesses, well, many would favor having neither, obviously. But if they had to choose between the two, and they were comparable stringency, they would favor the carbon tax because at least the tax tells them in advance the price. And they have a little more certainty about that, even though emissions are less known. So those are two of the options, and I would call these pricing options because they both end up one way, either direct, immediately, or by virtue of the cap, determining a price. Now I want to distinguish three important channels through which cap and trade, emissions taxes, or other policies yield reductions in emissions. One is they encourage fuel switching. So if we introduce a carbon tax or cap and trade, it's going to raise the price of coal-fired electricity relative to natural gas-fired electricity, because coal-fired electricity is more carbon intensive. It'll raise the price of coal relative to natural gas. Also raise coal and natural gas relative to, say, hydro or nuclear or solar. So it will encourage utilities to switch toward cleaner generators because those are going to face a relatively less increase in price. That's fuel switching, number one. The other thing that it does, second channel, is that it encourages conservation. So in the electricity example, to the extent that these are going to raise the cost of production to electricity producers, it's going to raise the price of electricity, which means that consumers are going to demand less electricity, be they industrial, residential, or commercial consumers. So that's important too, conservation. Third is it might encourage generation of new technology, because there's nothing like making conventional technology higher in price to give a leg up to alternatives. So it'll give solar or invention of new technologies more of a chance. So those are the three that I think are especially important. Fuel switching, conservation, and the generation of invention of new technologies. And emissions pricing primarily operates directly on the first two, but it does a little bit to encourage new technologies as well. So the rationale for these policies, I mean, if you read the papers, you read some politicians, you'll see what they say is to say, look, we really shouldn't be introducing these costly environmental policies. It's going to raise costs of production. There's some concern that's legitimate, I think, particularly in a depressed economy with a lot of unemployment, although I think that gets overplayed. But economic analysis, and those of you who have taken Econ 1 probably have seen that when you deal with these externalities, these costs to the environment that aren't incorporated automatically in business decisions, the cure is actually worth it. That is, the sacrifices that we make, the cost to consumers, the cost of lost profits, is smaller than the benefits that we get in terms of avoided damage to the climate. So there is a rationale in economics for these policies because the damages from emissions are an externality, and economic analysis shows that there's a market failure here in the sense that we're using too much electricity from a social point of view and we're producing it less cleanly than we should, that if we did something about these externalities, we would get benefits that exceed the costs. So it's not silly, provided the government forms the policy in a careful way. But it does raise another question. Are we wasting our time with cap and trade or with carbon taxes? Because these only indirectly deal with really promoting game-changing technologies.
many people will say that, you know, a little bit of conservation, a little bit of fuel switching, that ain't going to get us where we need to go. We've got to reduce our emissions by a huge amount, 50, 60, 70% over the next 60 years. In conservation, you're just not going to get enough of it that way or through fuel switching. We need game-changing technologies. We need fundamental changes, whether it's carbon capture and storage or some real advance in solar or fusion power. People would argue what we need is technology policy. We need direct policies to encourage new technologies. So should we have technology policy instead of emissions policy, as some politicians will say? Well, I'm going to suggest you need both. Emissions policy, like a carbon tax or gasoline tax associated with, or cap and trade or performance standards, that's one kind of approach. It largely encourages adjustments, however, among known process alternatives. So it doesn't directly encourage new technological innovation or invention. In contrast, technology policies such as R&D subsidies or contests or stronger patent rules, it does focus more explicitly on promoting the discovery of new and potentially game-changing technologies. Now, to be fair, they actually both, emissions policy does do a little bit of this. And technology policy also encourages a little bit of these sorts of adjustments. So they are interconnected. But most of the focus of technology policy is on invention, whereas most of the focus of emissions policy is on fuel switching and conservation. So are we wasting our time by even thinking about cap and trade or other forms of emissions policy? I would say no. Economic analysis actually suggests it's best to use both. There's a fundamental issue here. If you have two market failures, as we do, one is having to do with the externalities from emissions. The other has to do with a lot of the benefits from invention are not captured by the inventor. So there tends to be too little inventive activity in the absence of policy. Suggests that because there's two market failures, you need two approaches. One is an emissions policy to deal with the emissions market failure. Another is to use technology policy to deal with the fact that knowledge spills over is not entirely captured by the inventor, and therefore there tends to be too little inventive activity. You'll still have some, obviously, but too little in the absence of direct technology policy. And to give you an idea of the importance of technological change, I don't know, this will probably show my age more than you. Anybody recognize this guy? Who is it? Magnum. It's Magnum PI, which is a show. It's a private investigator series. This is Tom Selleck, the actor. It was a series that was like in the 1980 to 88. And he impressed people with his automobile, which is a Ferrari, I think a 360. And at this time, this was really one of the highest performance cars you could get. And at this time, given what was known at the time, all this performance, let's call this acceleration and horsepower, of this Ferrari came at the expense of fuel economy in a big way. This Ferrari probably got about 12 miles per gallon. And it also cost a lot. But we've had technological change, which means that this trade-off, because of technology and invention, no longer exists. In some sense, we've moved the whole curve up to the right, to the northeast. This is an Acura TL. Not the highest performance car. It's a nice car. It's a little better than my Honda Civic, but it's it's about a $35,000 car. So it's you don't have to be Tom Selleck to get it. The 86 Ferrari used by Magnum, or Tom Selleck, had 225 horsepower, 12, 13 miles per gallon, $96,000 in today's dollars. You couldn't really improve on miles per gallon in those days without a substantial loss of performance. But now the curve has shifted out because of technological change, because of invention, because of discovery. This Acura TL gives you more horsepower than this Ferrari. It gives you better gas mileage, and it costs you less. So invention counted a lot, which suggests that whatever you can do to improve knowledge, or at least doing a little more to improve knowledge, can make a big difference. In terms of this graph, we're now up here. This is where the trade-off is today. If you change engine sizes or car sizes, the weight of the car, you're still going to give up some performance, but you're moving along this frontier, but not this frontier. And the Acura TL is actually better in both respects than the Ferrari. Although I guess in some sense it's not as sexy, I got to admit. But it is up into the northeast. So this is at least to show that there's been a dramatic improvement in technology. Now you might say, well, if we get this improvement in technology, great, why do we need public policy?
Well, some would happen anyway. There obviously returns to being a brilliant entrepreneur or an engineer or someone who comes up with new discoveries. But my argument is that you won't get it as much and as fast as what would be best for society because of this knowledge spillover, the fact that an inventor can't internalize all the benefits from the new invention. And it means that the rewards or the incentives to invention from a social point of view are inadequate. So that suggests a role for technology policy. And indeed, in the case of automobiles, a lot of it was policy-driven, namely fuel economy standards, which provided an extra inducement to improve fuel economy and to invent in order to avoid having to make other adjustments which would cause a loss of profits to firms. So policy did have some effect. I'm not saying all of this movement of the frontier is due to policy, but a lot of it was. So I say there's a role for both, emissions policy and technology policy, and one to deal with each of the two market failures. And if you take any more economics, you can learn more about the market failures, how to measure them, and what kinds of policies might work. Now, I should emphasize also that politically, economists aren't divided about this notion that dealing with market failures can produce net benefits to society. If there's any disagreement, it's really, the more conservative economists will say the government's not up to the job, that somehow the government doesn't have good information or it's got bloated bureaucracy, it's just going to waste its resources. And that's an arguable proposition. It's an empirical proposition. Whereas the more optimistic or liberal economists will say, these are important market failures and the government ain't perfect, but it's going to do a lot of good. So leave that to you to contemplate. There's some talk today, it's become more fashionable, particularly in these times of a lot of unemployment. We should forget about emissions pricing and rely exclusively on technology policy. But again, theory and simulation models continue to suggest that the combination of the two is most cost effective. And let me give you one example, a recent paper by Carolyn Fisher and Richard Newell from Resources for the Future, a think tank in Washington, D.C. They show that the combination of the two is much cheaper in order to get a given target reduction in emissions of about 30%. 40% less costly than cap and trade alone if you use both. 85% less costly if you use both as compared to relying on an R&D subsidy alone. I'm going to just talk briefly about some things going on in California. As you probably know, AB 32 is sort of the centerpiece for California action. The goal is to reach 1990 level in emissions by 2020, which would be about a 24-25% reduction relative to what would be the case under business as usual. Three key components. Cap and trade is a big part of it. But they also have some other non-price approaches, a low-carbon fuel standard, which requires that refiners have a certain share of their fuels correspond to ethanol or low-carbon fuels. And it's somewhat controversial, but this is what it does. It's a way of forcing use of more clean fuels. It also will help with promoting new innovation. And similarly, there's a renewable portfolio standard that applies to utilities, and it requires that about a third of utilities' electricity purchase comes from what is deemed green or renewable sources, which includes hydropower, geothermal, and wind power. So it's really a combination of cap and trade and other things. And cap and trade, however, is facing very significant challenges. One is legal or legislative. This came out last February and is still in place. A federal judge in San Francisco said that California, the Air Resources Board, hadn't sufficiently considered alternatives to cap and trade in coming forward with cap and trade. And it's putting a hold on the cap and trade component on AB 32 until the Air Resources Board can really demonstrate that cap and trade is better than the alternatives. I'm fairly optimistic that this will ultimately not prevail. That is, that cap and trade will meet this legal challenge, although there might be further legal challenges. And a second important challenge is leakage. If you're worried about a problem like global climate change, clearly it would be best to approach it globally, since emissions from one country affect climate in other countries and vice versa. And moreover, if you introduce some policies sporadically in just some countries, not others, they put it at a competitive disadvantage. But we're not in that world yet. And so people in California who back California policy are banking on the idea that this will basically push forward a broader policy, that California, by taking action now, it'll be like a laboratory. It'll show
that you can introduce these policies without wrecking the economy, and that will accelerate the introduction or hasten the arrival of similar policies in the rest of the nation, indeed the rest of the world. To put it another way, if you really felt that California's action wasn't going to stimulate other action outside of California or outside of the nation, it'd be much harder to justify it because California would face all of the costs of its policies, and it would only enjoy one very small fraction of the global climate benefits. So it's a strategic motive that's really encouraging California to do this. They're hoping to be able to stimulate others taking action sooner than they otherwise would. But in the absence, until that happens, there's some problems of leakage. That is, what California does could lead to offsetting increases in emissions elsewhere. One is it could cause firms to leave. Facing higher prices, they're going to leave. They'd rather move to Nevada, where they're not facing cap and trade or other policies that's going to raise their costs. So in that case, California emissions may go down, but Nevada's emissions will go up by the same amount, or approximately. What good is that? Another issue is that it could lead to shifts in electricity consumption that undo the desired effects of the policy. In particular, if you introduce a policy in California, raise costs to California's generators, the purchasers of electricity, namely the utilities, are going to shift their purchases away from California generation to Nevada or Utah generation, which isn't facing these controls. It's going to lead to increased emissions from the generation in other states. So again, what good is that? So there are various attempts that I won't have time to go into, but there are ways to try to deal with this by making Nevada or Utah or other states' electricity production subject to California law. There's no perfect solution. One way partly out is so-called the Western Climate Initiative, which would involve all these other states now joining up with California. But the problem there is that many states more recently have sort of pulled out. And of these 7 US states and 4 Canadian provinces, only one US state remains very active, namely California, and 3 Canadian provinces. So it's become weakened, and that means that the leakage problem is going to remain as a very big challenge because the support for the WCI, the Western Climate Initiative, has eroded over time. So I'm going to conclude. You know about the strong scientific consensus. The political consensus isn't so strong, isn't as strong. There's justification in economic analysis for emissions pricing and direct technology promotion. There's going to be continued court challenges and possibly legislative challenges as well, particularly in these hard economic times. It's really hard to put forth environmental policy when people are unemployed. Anything that suggests higher costs to the state or the nation faces a bigger challenge. Even if these legislative challenges are overcome, leakage remains a significant problem. And even if leakage is contained, California's efforts will have only a small direct effect on the future course of climate, unless, or up until the point where it promotes, or catalyzes similar efforts outside of California and the rest of the world. So to have a significant impact on climate, California's efforts must be ultimately accompanied by broader regional, national, or international efforts. And this is what supporters of California's efforts are banking on. Questions? Yes?
In order for cap and trade to work, like, what do you think the circumstances have to be? Because globally, it's had a rough go so far. And I'm just wondering what you think the conditions have to be for it to succeed.
For it to succeed physically or for it to succeed politically?
Just overall, like physically and politically.
It has had a mixed success. I would say it hasn't been entirely bad, though. I mean, the efforts in Southern California to deal with local pollution under cap and trade in the Los Angeles region, I think, have largely been successful, although controversial. The effort under the Clean Air Act to reduce emissions of sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides has been considered by about everybody to be a big success. So why was that successful in that case? I think one is that you're dealing with a fairly easily monitored pollutant. Sulfur dioxide can be relatively easily monitored. Second, the market is big enough so that no single entity can exercise strategic power, which happened to be partly of a problem in Southern California. I guess a third issue is that you have to have credibility. And in the European Union's emissions trading scheme, they initially, in order to get it through, they issued so many allowances that they actually hardly bound any of the polluters, and the prices were almost zero. And that really hurt public faith in the program. I would say there's one more issue, and I'm not sure I have a solution to it, but it really is central to whether it's a success or not, and that's how you allocate the allowances, whether you auction them or giving them out free. And many critics of cap and trade really are against giving them out free because they think that just creates windfalls to the polluters. So that remains very contentious, and I think in the US, if we ever move to a cap and trade system, that will be a central issue in the discussions. Other questions? Yes?
I had a question, you touched on it briefly, but about the technology policy.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say to the people who argue that the government has no business or no ability to accurately pick a technology with something that's the taxpayer money?
I think that's a very important issue. On the issue of whether the government has any business, I think you can address that on two levels. One is just simply if you can substantiate the notion that there's a market failure and that we're getting too little, in general, innovation because of the knowledge spillover. And you can show, therefore, that a subsidy to new technologies is going to lead to, in expectation, on average, to greater benefits from the new knowledge than it costs taxpayers from the subsidy. That helps justify it. But I think there's another concern that your question raises, which is that government may not be very good at picking winners. I think that's absolutely right. And so I think there's more of a justification for generalized technology policy that gives subsidies in general form to R&D. You're not claiming that any particular R&D effort is going to create a winner, but you know that the general subsidy on average is going to create enough winners to justify it. It's just like when a venture capital firm decides that it's going to invest in 10 different ventures. If it gets 1 out of 10 as a big winner, it's lucky. Well, I do think that the government, in some sense, is in a more precarious situation when it tries to direct all of its help toward one particular technological effort, and that spreading your bets is a much better idea. And obviously, when you spread your bets, you're going to lose some. But the hope is by spreading, you're going to get some big winners as well. Any other comments? Oh, yeah.
I guess on that point, I mean, what are your thoughts on from the technology perspective, the things that the government has done to support some technologies, the loan guarantees, RPE, things like that? I mean, what's your view on whether you think those are good or bad, and where will those be going in the next 5 years?
Yeah, there is a way in which these loan guarantees and RPE violates the principle that I suggested earlier, which is not to sort of bet on any particular technologies. But I think one needs to be a bit flexible and also respect the political constraints. And I think in some cases there's been sort of prior information that suggests that these technologies are particularly promising and that there may be certain problems like capital market imperfections, which means that what really the private sector needs, it needs a boost to get over the initial outlay. And so there I think it's a little, one can offer some justification for directed support. But I think it's a judgment call, frankly. But I do not have a big problem with many of the loan guarantee programs in place. Because I think that they do have some justification based on prior information.
We have another one down in the middle here. I had a related question. Just wondering what has been the country experience with like phasing these kinds of incentives out at the right time? I was just thinking about Germany, the potential version of the incentives they're providing for renewables. I was wondering if there's like what is the experience about what is the right time frame for those kinds of incentives? And,
I see. I'll repeat your question for those who might not be able to hear from. The question is, what's been the record in terms of phasing out subsidies at some point, particularly in Europe? And I have two answers to that. One is that to the extent that you think that the innovation market failure persists, there's no reason to phase out the subsidy. There's an argument that as long as the knowledge spillover remains, there's still an argument for either liberalized tough patent rules or R&D support. That said, I think you might be thinking of certain cases where there were certain forms of subsidy where you direct it toward a particular industry in a particular way, so you should pull it out. And I confess, I don't have a lot of good information on what the success rate is there. I do think you raise an important point, because if anything we know about politics is once you offer a benefit, it becomes a property right to a firm and to that industry, and it's very hard to take it away. So that is an important issue. In the context of cap and trade, suppose you claim that you want to give out allowances free for a short term, but later stop offering them free and auctioning them. It can become very difficult once you've reached that point in time when you're supposed to retract the free allocation, because at that point firms will ally themselves and say, no, don't take it away. Just as another point, I happen to feel that our clean development mechanism program under Kyoto is not a well-designed program, but now there's such an industry of lawyers and countries that are recipients of the clean development program, it's going to be very hard to go back. So there is always the danger of once you offer certain kind of support, it's difficult to take away. I think we have time for one more.
Yeah, one more, and then we need to wrap up.
Okay.
Is there an optimal use of the tax revenue that's generated if you auction off the emission allowances?
That's a great question. In fact, there is an optimal use in terms of economic efficiency. That is, and even some of my own work is focused on this. The best way in terms of cutting the overall cost to the economy of cap and trade, for example, is to take the auction revenues and use those to finance cuts in existing distortionary taxes like income and sales taxes. Rather than to give the revenues back free as a rebate, use it to cut marginal tax rates of income or sales taxes. And the reason is, economics tells us that these taxes, income taxes and sales taxes, create distortions and they create a certain amount of waste. They create benefits as well. But if we could auction the revenues, auction the allowances, take the revenue, use it to finance cuts in other taxes that are distortionary, then not only do you improve the environment through cap and trade system, you allow the tax system to work better. As a political matter, it's been difficult to push that through. It seems like politically, there's been more support for just giving the money back to households as a fixed rebate. But then you don't enjoy that you don't make the tax system work better because you're not cutting marginal rates. So oftentimes what economists suggest for efficiency is not in line with what others would say is politically most feasible.